Today, we become legends.
There's been a lot of buzz in the community lately about Smite 2's Relic system, with some prominent pro players and content creators throwing their hat in the ring on the topic and asking the question of whether we should return to the 2 Relic system of Smite 1 in favour of Smite 2's 1 Relic system. Of course, going into Smite 2, the original plan was to not even have a Relic system, so to speak. The plan was just to give everyone beads and let active items sort out the rest. You might not remember at this point, but Blink used to be an active item and Aegis didn't even exist in those early alpha weekends. However, it was quickly realized that having an effect as powerful and essential as Blink on an active item would just make it so every god who previously relied on Blink in Smite 1, which is a massive portion of the cast by the way, would be forced into buying Blinking Amulet early on in their build. I mean, just think about how many gods buy Blink in Smite 1. It's damn near every jungler, plus a lot of solo laners and even some supports. I would say a conservative estimate is 30% of all players in the match will buy Blink in Smite 1, but it's probably more than that to be honest. This would basically lead to a situation where build diversity is crushed, because every jungler will be forced to rush this Blink active item in first or second slot because of just how essential it is to most junglers for their ganks and engages in teamfights. This leads to every jungler just having the same stats and the same fight potential with literally no other options in the early game. And while there will always be a meta build, for example in Smite 1 you would very often see both junglers rushing Jotun's Wrath, there is a small but important distinction in players simply choosing the best of a few options compared to literally only having one option. And everything else is trolling, which is the situation that almost certainly would have arisen if Blink remained as an active item and not a relic in Smite 2. So they made the smart play and decided to expand the relic system to include Blink, Aegis, Shell, and Sunder in addition to beads, and it's been a moderate success I would say. While Blink is the most popular, beads and Aegis also see quite a bit of use, and there's genuine reasons to build one of those two instead of Blink, while Shell and Sunder see occasional play on supports for the most part, and sometimes on solos. I do think the current relic system is working better than people give it credit for, but there absolutely are still issues arising from it, which brings me to the main point of the video that's been brought up by various pros and community members in the last few days. The argument essentially boils down to this: Smite 1 has had over 10 years of design decisions based around having 2 relics, and Smite 2 is carrying over basically all of those designs and even adding more to them. This leads to situations where, for example, having just beads isn't enough, or just Aegis isn't enough, or just Blink isn't enough, and it's been brought to the forefront by the recent CA7 update that added Thor, Poseidon, and Cupid, as all 3 of these gods are extremely hard to deal with using just one relic. If you take Blink, sure you can react to a Thorul and blink out of it, but you're still going to have issues with his stun into double tap combo. And worse yet, you can blink in combat, but you can't blink while crippled, and so blink is damn near useless as a defensive utility against Cupid and Poseidon, since if they ever land their ultimate or 3 on you respectively, that blink is unusable and you take the full force of whatever they want to drop on you with no beads or Aegis to counter it. If you take Aegis, you can sort of immune Thor's ult combo by reacting to it with Aegis if you know it's coming, and you can immune most of the damage from Poseidon's ultimate, but you can't immune the CC, and so really it doesn't still counter it, because all of the follow-up damage after your Aegis ends and you're stunned and stuck in a whirlpool will just eat you alive, so Aegis isn't really a good answer on its own either. So you go beads, right? Well again, it's only half an answer, as you can beads the stun of Thorul and avoid most of his follow-up damage, but you're still going to take the ult base damage and probably the 3 damage, plus maybe a bit of extra from random lightning or the first hit of his hammer. Against Poseidon it's a little better, especially if you have mobility, since if you're fast enough you can beads the cripple and jump away from Kraken, avoiding almost all the damage. But you have to be very fast on doing that, and the Poseidon can even exploit this by just 3ing you and faking his ult so you waste your beads. Cupid is similar, you can beads the cripple and jump away, but you're still going to take at least some damage in the process, and if you don't have a jump then beads is pretty much going to do nothing for you, so it's not really a full counter, just a partial one once again. Some gods that were already in Smite 2 prior to this update had similar issues, where they can't really be dealt with appropriately using one relic, but the fact that CA7 added all 3 of these gods that seem literally designed to break open the one relic system has really brought this issue to the forefront. Every single one of those examples I just listed can be full countered if you have any combination of the 3 relics listed. If you're a jungler that goes beads Blink, well, Blink is now usable in combat, so you can beads Poseidon's cripple and blink out of the Kraken. Same with Cupid and same with Thor by beating his stun and blinking away. If you're a backliner that goes beads Aegis, then it's just like Smite 1 where you can just pop both and easily escape all the CC and damage of Kraken and Thor's full combo, for example. I guess Aegis Blink is a little more complicated, since any ability that locks you down with CC as or before it does its damage will still wreck you, but anyone who knows Smite 1 will know that Aegis Blink was not a popular combo whatsoever, and you would basically always pick between Aegis and Blink and pair your choice with beads. just because of how essential it is to counterplay some of Smite's myriad of crushing CC abilities. Which brings me back to the point I made earlier. Smite 1 has been designed for over a decade around the fact that every squishy target will have beads no matter what. And while changes were made going into Smite 2 to try and address that, with all CCs across the board being reduced in duration by 20% and DR being normalized so that getting hit by 1 CC is less deadly, but getting chain CC'd is more deadly, even with those changes, it's still very apparent that Smite's gods were designed with the prerequisite thought that every backliner will have both beads and Aegis every single game. I do think the DR changes were a good idea, but could have been better thought out. Personally, I think making the DR reduction somewhere in the middle of Smite 1 and 2, but making the DR stacks last even shorter, would have been the way in my opinion. In case you're not familiar with diminishing returns on CC or DR, it's basically a system in place to lessen the effects of chain CC. When you're hit by a hard CC, you gain a DR stack. Each stack makes future hard CCs on you last 20% less time. In Smite 1, this stacked up to 4 times for 80% reduction and stacks lasted 15 seconds. In Smite 2, they changed this to only stack twice up to a 40% reduction and stacks last 6 seconds. This was on feedback that was, in my opinion, justified, that said DR was far too strong and it felt like you were punished for far too long after the initial CCs hit the enemy. Because they lasted 15 seconds, you could completely disengage a fight, re-engage 10 seconds later, which is a long time in Smite terms, and the enemy was still DR'd, and your blink Ymir freeze lasted 0.4 seconds, and that feels awful. Especially when the mechanic is poorly explained to players and many more casual fans aren't even aware of its existence. I do think the main issue with DR wasn't necessarily the reduction percentage, but how long the stacks lasted. So I think a change in Smite 2 that makes DR a bit stronger but last even less time would be appropriate. Maybe allow DR to stack 3 times up to a 60% reduction, but only let DR stacks last 2 or 3 seconds, so it truly is a system that counters chain CC and not just counters all CC in a fight. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but DR is directly related to this issue, as beads are at the heart of why some people are calling for a return to the 2 relic system, and when they made DR even weaker in Smite 2, beads became even more of a necessity. Which, speaking of, this is once again hurting build diversity, specifically in the support role, where if you're not rushing the AoE team beads active in your first or second slot, you're basically trolling. I do think it's fun that supports have more influence over the game through active items, but it does get a little tedious to be forced into rushing the exact same item every single game. Very similar to the blinking amulet situation in the early alpha weekends, this is different to, for example, supports always rushing Thebes in Smite 1. In that case, it's just someone buying the best and most efficient early item, not an item they are literally forced to buy because of its powerful active effect. This leads to a situation we're already seeing where the item is so popular that it's already getting base stat nerfs to compensate for how much it's being built. And if that continues, supports will end up feeling awful about rushing Talisman because the stats are horrendous, but it's so essential that they would begrudgingly have to do it anyway. This is just yet another symptom of the one relic system, with less of the team having access to bees because they might want to go blink on a jungler or Aegis into a Zeus or Poseidon. It means the support basically has to be the beads for the team, which again, I do think is a fun idea, but it might be better if they were the backup beads and not the only beads, which would be the case under a 2 relic system. That would make Talisman a lot less outright essential, and it might only be picked up against heavy CC teams or gods, like Ares, Cupid, Hunbats, that kind of stuff. That sounds a lot more healthy for the game overall, to me at least. On the topic of items, the fact that crowd control reduction still hasn't been added to the game as a stat is probably making the situation a bit worse as well. Sure, in Smite 1, basically no backliner items had CCR, it was all on tank items, but that was under the 2 relic system. I think if Hi-Rez do intend to keep the 1 relic system in Smite 2, adding CCR to backliner items could absolutely help solve some of the issues they're currently facing. To provide some pushback though, I do think the 1 relic system does present an interesting dynamic in itself, in that you can't just hard counter literally anything in the game once every few minutes by pressing beads Aegis, and there's a genuine trade-off to going blink because you forgo beads. I think that is an interesting dynamic, and it could work if a lot of effort was put into rebalancing CC in Smite 2 even more than it already has been. But getting to a point that will actually work is going to be extremely difficult. You can't just keep reducing all CC durations across the board, as that would break some characters completely. Think about Thor, for example, who, if the stun on his 2 doesn't last long enough to confirm the second hit of his 1, or if the stun on his ult doesn't last long enough to confirm the stun from his 2, then the whole character design just breaks down. We see a microcosm of this with DR, as if the target is at very high DR stacks, these Thor combos are no longer true, which is sort of fine because it's not all the time. But if every god was permanently at max DR stacks, Thor would just not work as a character design whatsoever. So you can't just keep reducing CC durations until the game feels okay with a 1 relic system, because things will start to break on certain gods. So while I do think 1 relic presents some interesting dynamics, decisions to make, and trade-offs, I think the heavily entrenched design Smite has gone with over the last decade means that this system might just never work. To make a quick comparison to another MOBA, League of Legends has had CC problems in the past, of course, all MOBAs have, but their equivalent of beads, cleanse, is only picked up in very specific situations where an enemy champion would just kill you for free if you didn't buy cleanse. The vast majority of the time it's not even bought, and flash, the blink equivalent, is infinitely more popular than cleanse. The issue is, League has been designed for over a decade around flash, not around cleanse, whereas Smite has been designed around beads, and to a lesser extent Aegis, and it feels like almost every god in the game has some ludicrously powerful CC that, if not cleansed, basically insta-kills you. And even beyond that, some abilities like we mentioned earlier with Poseidon's ultimate literally require you to not only have beads but also Aegis to fully deal with them. Just having one of these relics means you either avoid the damage but get CC'd for several seconds and die afterwards anyway, or you immune the CC but still take half your health and damage and probably die to follow up also. And with how low the cooldown on some of these instant death abilities are, the game of Smite just sort of breaks down with only one relic. As I said, I do think this system introduces some very interesting decisions to make, and we might be able to get used to it over time and with some fundamental changes to the game and how CC works. But that will be incredibly difficult to pull off, and it might just be simpler and easier to make a return to a more Smite 1-like relic system of 2 choices. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you think a 1 relic system could work with some tweaks to the game, or would you rather just see the 2 relic system brought back for Smite 2? Definitely leave your thoughts down below, as this is a very interesting and quite divisive topic within the Smite community at the moment, and I'm very interested to hear what the general thoughts of you guys are on this. But I'll catch you in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.